My name is Gerry Clum. I'm a chiropractor. I graduated from Chiropractic College in 1973, and since that time I have had the opportunity to both practice and to work in teaching and administration in chiropractic education. For the last 28 years it's been my good fortune to serve as the president of Life Chiropractic College West in Hayward, California. The reason I'm a chiropractor today is the story and the miracle that I'd like to discuss with you. The reality is that when I was 12 years old, my parents were told that I either had a brain tumor or I had a tumor at the optic chiasm, which is an area deep within the brain where centers from the brain come together, cross, and then go out to the eyes, or I had multiple sclerosis. And the prognosis was that there would be a progressive deterioration of my eyesight. I would likely be blind by the time I was 18, and my parents would be better off to get me into Braille school right away. I was 12 years old at the time, and my parents had taken me all over the country. We lived in Buffalo, New York, and we'd gone through New York City, and we'd gone to Cleveland, and we went to the Cleveland clinics and the premier diagnostic institutions of the day. And the conclusion was the same. It was either an optic chiasm issue or possible multiple sclerosis. And this is pre-MRI days, pre-CT scan days. And my parents were devastated. The idea that you're looking at a 12-year-old who will be blind by the time they're 18 is not the prognosis that any parent wants to see. My father, while we had been away for some testing in Cleveland, had missed several appointments to see a chiropractor. And we went back, and I happened to go with him to the office that day, and the fellow asked, he said, "Where you been?" And my dad explained. And it was end of the day, and my father was the last patient that was being seen. And this chiropractor, his name was Cameron Cassan, a little town called Port Colborne, Ontario, between Buffalo and Toronto, on the shores of Lake Erie. And he sat down with my dad in a second-story office, a 6-chair waiting room, took out a Boyd's pathology, a Gray's anatomy, and a Guyton's physiology, and began to dissect for my father what bilateral optic atrophy of progressive nature and of an idiopathic origin meant. My dad was a smart man. He wasn't a well-educated man, and he was quite accomplished in his business life. But I can remember as a 12-year-old kid sitting in that chair in that waiting room, watching the fear and the suffering drain from my dad's face as this chiropractor explained to my father what these words meant and what the reality of it meant for me as the patient and the person having this problem. And at the end of that conversation, probably the most fateful phrase that ever was uttered in my life is that chiropractor looked at my father and he said, "Don, I don't know if I can help the boy. I guarantee I wouldn't hurt him, and I would love the chance to try." I got my first adjustment that night, and I continued to get adjusted throughout that summer. I was 12 years old at the time. And in the fall, we returned to the ophthalmologist, and literally with a Camel cigarette in one hand and an ophthalmoscope in the other hand in a basement office in his home, this physician explained that this was a miracle, what had happened to this boy. And my father explained that he had been to see a chiropractor. And his response was, "I wouldn't take my dog to a chiropractor." Well, that moment in that chair in the ophthalmologist office is when I decided to be a chiropractor. And I've really had such a tremendous good fortune in that at 12 years old, I don't know that many people have the opportunity to lock on to their life's work, and I did. And I began the pursuit of my degree, and then my career involved and unfolded from that point forward. And my eyesight continued to improve over the course of that summer. And prior to the time that I received those adjustments, my vision was 2800 correctable to 2200. And at the end of that summer, it was 2200 correctable to 2090. And it took until I was about my early 20s that I eventually qualified and my vision improved to the point that I could get a driver's license. Many in my family still think that's quite a mistake on the part of government to have given me that, but the reality is they did, and I do have it today and use it quite a bit. But the point is, as a young boy, that was never a possibility. So chiropractic set the stage and gave me such a depth and appreciation for what can happen in the presence of an adjustment. The reason my father missed those early appointments with that chiropractor was low back pain. At that point, I thought chiropractic care was good for low back pain, which it is. But my experience was so far removed from my low back or from a pain experience that it completely reconfigured my understanding and appreciation of chiropractic at that time and throughout my entire career. So that's been the story of how, when, where, and why I became a chiropractor. And the entire sum and substance of my career, I have tried to live as a payback to that chiropractor for what he did in my life with my father in that office on an early summer night in 1964. So that's the miracle for me. If it wouldn't be inappropriate, I'd like to tell you another very closely related story. Several years later, I was married in 1974, and in the summer of 1978, we had our second child. And her name is Cassie, and she was born on August 6th, 1978. And my wife was having a very difficult time with the labor, and the obstetrician involved decided that it would be helpful to break the waters. As soon as they broke the waters, they realized the waters were meconium stained. It looked like dirty dishwater, not like what you'd hope to see with a birth. And everybody knew the baby was in distress. The child was subsequently born seconds later, and she was in profound distress. Within an hour, her spleen and her liver had swollen to the point that they were in her pelvic cavity. She had petechial, strawberry, pinpoint type hemorrhages from her head to her toe. She was a very sick child, and they immediately thought she had spinal meningitis. And she was quarantined and moved to a neonatal nursery center. And it became very apparent, because of a history in my circumstances, that what had happened is that she had become congenitally infected with an organism, a virus known as cytomegalovirus. And it hit somewhere between the 4th and the 5th month of the pregnancy, and it resulted in Cassie being born with all of these problems. At birth, it was thought that she was deaf and that she was blind, which fortunately she was not. Although today she does have a profound hearing loss in one ear, but her eyesight is good and her functional hearing is very good. But over the years, she has had a mild cerebral palsy presentation. She'll never dance the ballet. She'll never worry about a quadratic equation. But, you know, of all of my children, she's held a job longer than all of the others put together. So she's doing very well and getting by in the world. The turning point back in the summer of 1978, Cassie was in that neonatal nursery center, and the influence of that virus was that her platelet count, among all of the other problems with the hepatic swelling and the splenic swelling and so on, but her platelet count had dropped to approximately 10,000 per cubic millimeter. It should be 250,000. At 10,000 per cubic millimeter, it's the equivalent of pumping water as opposed to 40-weight oil. The person is susceptible to cardiac contractions, can cause hemorrhage. Peristalsis can cause hemorrhage. And where you should have a thick fluid that you're pumping through blood, you're pumping virtually water. Very, very thin, greatly subject to hemorrhaging. And it was assumed that she would have a stroke. She wouldn't live. And, you know, we had best do whatever we could. Well, it was a day and time when it was impossible for a chiropractor to come into a neonatal nursery center in a hospital and provide care. This same chiropractor that gave me my first adjustment showed up at the door of our home. He had a 12-pack of Molson's Canadian beer for me to treat the father, and he had an adjustment for my daughter. We took him to that neonatal nursery center as Reverend Kassan, because Dr. Kassan wasn't welcome. The child was going to die, in their opinion, so the idea that we wanted to bring clergy in was no problem. Well, he pulled the drape in the neonatal nursery center and he proceeded to adjust my daughter. We forgot that she was attached to a dozen different monitors, and as he delivered that adjustment and things changed, all of the monitors went off. The neonatal nursery center was like a 5-alarm fire. There were people coming from all directions, running, hollering, etc. And he pulled back the drape, walked out. Remember, he was Reverend Kassan after that adjustment, so he said, "Praise God," and headed to the door. And within 12 hours, Cassie's platelet count had climbed from 10,000 per cubic millimeter to 100,000. Within 24 hours, it was a $250,000. And within 2 days, she was home with us. As I said, Cassie's not normal in the context of textbook normal. She has been one of my life's greatest teachers, I'll tell you that. She gets by in the world. She lives on her own. She has a very comfortable living. And as I said, she's been employed for the last 13 years and very successfully. So that miracle to, number one, give us our daughter, and number two, to allow us to be reconnected and rejoined as a family, and then to allow her the opportunity to live out what potential she has from that very rocky beginning. Quite an important moment and series of moments in my life and in my daughter's life and in our entire family's life as well.